It's important to properly dispose of unwanted medication or sharps. MedProject offers free and convenient disposal options near you. To learn more, call 844-MedProject or visit medproject.org.
This episode is brought to you by Utilize, the app that lets you rent anything to and from your neighbors. Rent paddleboards, trailers, bounce houses, and just about anything else. You can turn it into an easy side hustle by renting out the stuff you already own. Best of all, it's a greener way to live because you don't need to buy the party supplies, outdoor gear, or tools that you'll only use once or twice. Now just rent them, all for less. Download the app today. Utilize. YOODLIZE.
Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Join us as we seek the truth and travel the long road to justice. What's going on, everybody? It's Sunday, and it's time for another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. What's good, Fruit Loop?
I can tell you what's not good is my legs. They feel like jello.
What did you do?
I helped some friends move out of their second-story apartment.
Oh.
I'm going to tell you, I ain't going to have to work out for the next 4 weeks.
You got some rickety old bones now.
75 billion trips up the stairs.
Oh, no.
But it was good. They got all their stuff out and all that stuff. But my legs feel like jello.
Yeah, you look like you've been riding a horse.
Oh, yeah. Yep. When I get up, it's like, oh. Yep.
Oh, man. So hopefully we don't have any fire alarms go off today.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Mason's not allowed to cook while we're filming our episode anymore.
That's right.
He cannot be trusted.
No. So, just so you know, it is freezing in here.
Okay, I have an excuse this time. I realize why I've been hot lately. I ran out of my hormones, and so I finally got them refilled. So this may be your last day of feeling like you're in the Arctic over here.
Yeah, I could have on a parka and one of those Eskimo hats or whatever. Yeah, I'm putting an alert on my phone to remind you to get that.
No, I went and got it, and I've already taken my dose. So maybe halfway through, I'll be freezing along with you when that stuff hits my bloodstream.
Yeah, probably not.
That's the worst thing about my 40 so far, y'all.
Yeah. So how's old Sherlock doing?
Sherlock's been good. He's definitely improved his behavior, but every night for the last couple of days, I just wake up and I can't breathe. I'm stuffy and my eyes are watery, and I constantly look like I just have partaken in some marijuana.
I was gonna say you've been in the boxing ring with Muhammad Ali or something.
But what I found out is the cat comes in covered in pollen and then proceeds to lay on my bed and sleep for half the day, and I just caught it. So now I know why I can't breathe at night.
So the cat's got to get brushed or washed.
I got some of those cat wipes that you can wipe him off with. The only problem is he doesn't like it.
I was about to say, how's that going?
It's not going. And but I tell you what's not going is my sinuses at night. They're getting clogged up, and so something's got to give.
Just put the fan in front of and blow it off.
Yeah, so I can just blow it all over the house.
There
That makes perfect sense. So
wear a mask.
The problem is if I shut my bedroom door, he just stands out there and meows really loud. So that's a catch-22.
Yeah, his meow is very loud.
It's very loud. He was blessed with some big lungs, and
yeah.
So I have some restless car syndrome, and I'm going to get another Jeep, I think, this week.
That'll be cool.
Yeah, I'm excited. The kids, we went and looked at it. We're going to get the either the Sahara Wrangler or the Rubicon. So I'm excited about that. That'll be fun to take down to the beach.
Cool. Get that tow package on the back.
Oh, I know, right? I'm glad you reminded me.
Yeah, get that.
So this is a pretty big episode that we have been waiting to do for a little while now.
Yeah, since February.
Yeah. And so Fruit Loop, why don't you tell everybody how this came to be?
So we did some podcasts early on going through some of this stuff we're going to talk about today. And he reached out and wanted to clear some things up. So he gave me his phone number and said, give me a call. And so we called him, and 3 hours later.
I think it was more 3.5.
Yeah, it was a long, and he said from the get-go, this is going to take a long time.
He did. And so essentially, I think what happened is he heard the episode where we were going through some of the custody papers.
Yep.
And I called him out because I had read what was in there. So I said, well, why is he offering to change his testimony to stay on the case and that sort of thing? And I think now that we know his side of the story, everything obviously was not on that paper. And that's a lot of times how it goes. You only get part of the story.
Yep.
So, of course, I felt incredibly guilty that I called him out. And I'm that way. Even if somebody deserves to be called out by me, even in personal life, and I do it, I feel guilty. Like, I don't know. I don't like to make anybody feel bad.
Yeah.
And so I felt really, really bad after we talked to him. And so, but he was very forthcoming and he was very happy to answer questions we had. And I thought he was a very nice guy.
He was very nice. Just anything we asked, he answered. So
without hesitation.
Yeah.
And so we're going to jump right in. I think this may end up and be 2 episodes because there is a lot that we sifted through. We had to have this transcribed and then we just kind of have waited for the right time and we feel like it's now.
Yeah, because we had some other cases we were doing stuff with too. And he was on Dateline, so.
Right, and we wanted to make sure that was over with before we did this.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing he says that we just don't have a clue that you don't learn everything from just reading court documents, and that's right. That's very
totally
true.
Agree, and I think I've learned that through this one instance.
I agree, 100%. And so yeah, because I can say my opinion of him from the episode we did way back when. I think it was maybe even late last summer. My opinion of him is very different after we talked to him.
Yeah.
And got his side. And that's a lesson for me doing this, is that before I put a strong opinion like that out there about somebody who's not directly related to this case, maybe get their side first.
Yep.
Instead of blasting them, I'm sorry.
Well, sometimes it's hard because you can't contact them.
Right.
So you're relying on court documents, which you think would be truth. But we had a friend of ours tell us today that an attorney's job is to get their client off.
Right.
So
and they're paid retainers and they fight for their clients. So, of course, attorneys are going to do what's best for them. So let's go ahead and get started.
So this case is just layer upon layer.
We're just going to say real quick, I'm sorry, Fruit Loop. These are his words.
Yes.
This is what he said, so we're quoting him.
Yeah.
As good as the transcription could allow.
Yeah, some of it was a little weird. But he said this case is just layer upon layer. I held a lot of investigation. He says I actually have 56 typed pages of single space pages worth of notes in this case. They were extremely detailed of who I talked to, phone numbers, even what I was thinking and what I was trying to get to. He says I'm able to remember pretty much all these little different nuances and parts of this case. It's all documented. He has it, 56 typewritten pages.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about this as a whole is that he and Vivian did not find out about this case until January of this year.
Yeah, I was shocked on that. As big as it is.
He says, many months ago, I saw something on TV and it was actually Lori, but he didn't realize it was Lori at the time. He says, I made kind of a mental note to myself because I couldn't remember names or any of that, but the lady looked familiar. Maybe that crazy case I had back in 2007, but I just put it in the back of my mind. I didn't think much about it. So about a month ago, I decided I needed to start purging some of these files because I needed space in my garage. So I grabbed files and I was shredding them and I got to this case, the case involving Joe Ryan, Lori, and custody of Tylee. He says, I didn't really look at the case and I've already shredded about 3/4 of the file, at least one of the files, but he did have a second set.
Yeah. And I think it's important here. He was in private practice.
Right.
So some of you may be saying, why do you have all these files at home? But he was in private practice.
Yes. At that point, he called Vivian, and she hadn't heard anything about the case either. So the both of them that worked hard on this had no clue. And when they figured it out, they were just floored. And he said, we tried to tell them back then that she was a danger to her kids.
Yeah.
And he says, as you already know, this case is crazy. When I first discovered all of this, I went through a lot of YouTube videos and I'm thinking, where's Joe? Why doesn't Joe say something about this? Because he'd be all over this. And then I find he's dead. And then I find Charles is dead. Everybody is dying in this case.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we know this case is crazy, but to hear his side of it and not know Joe's dead.
Right.
And he brings up a good point because he he spoke a lot with Joe. And he said, you know, he would be all over this.
Right. So in not knowing the details of everything that's happened, only that Lori's in the news because her kids are dead, he finds out Charles and Joe are dead too.
Yeah.
That has to be such a huge shock, but probably not. I think after we talked to him, I think they knew. I think he and Vivian knew very early on she was not right.
Yeah. Yep. So from the start, he says he was appointed guardian ad litem. And he said for this particular situation, he was in private practice at the time. And he says this will make sense to you more when we start talking about Mary Fogel and all that, because she's a public person or whatever. She's with Travis County Domestic Relations Office. And he knows Mary quite well because he used to work with her. And he had worked 5 years at the Domestic Relations Office as a guardian ad litem, and then he went in private practice for himself. So if you remember, Mary Fogel was brought onto the case later on after Vivian
right.
left the case. So then Mary Fogel was brought on. He says this case came at kind of the end of his career for various reasons, but he had been doing this work over 20 years. He is a mental health professional. He has his master's degree in counseling, and he's been in the mental health field for all this time. His first visit he had was actually with Joe. And he says Joe, of course, denied all these allegations. He had confirmed, this was interesting what he said. He had confirmed that Lori was being abusive to Colby, that he recalled Joe telling him a story that Lori actually punched Colby right straight in the chest when he was asked. Colby asked to go get ice cream with Joe, and Lori punched him in the chest.
That's weird.
Yeah.
So he goes on to say that Lori had a sister who died and that she believed Tylee was her sister who had been reincarnated. So there was already some strangeness to Tom and Vivian very early on. And he said her affect was really off, and most people are kind of upset and sad that their kids may have been sexually abused. But he said it just seemed to be the opposite with her. She was happy that all this happened. So then he starts investigating the case. And the abuse allegations as far as Tylee, they never thought from the beginning that she was abused.
And remember, she's 4 years old at the time.
Right. So
Yeah.
the main allegation that Tylee made is that her dad crashes into her, and they said they never could figure it out. It just didn't make sense, and especially coming from a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
So that's when he brings Vivian onto the case.
Yeah. So Vivian's been doing this for years and years and years. She's published. She's not a psychologist. She's a registered sex offender provider. And essentially what that means is that her specialty is in sex offenses treatment for an assessment. He says she's probably the best therapist in Austin, if not in the state. And probably she's nationally renowned. She's done work for the military. She's published papers. She's top notch in her field. He says it turned out that apparently Joe and Lori, this was interesting.
Yes.
It turned out that apparently Joe and Lori had also seen Vivian before this case started. So Vivian had a vague recollection of these two, but they agreed to go ahead and continue with her and to do this assessment and all that. So Vivian starts interviewing the kids, but something happens during this event. Vivian becomes sick, and it's not cancer. I think in her first, we thought it might be.
Right, yeah.
So he said it wasn't cancer. He said, honestly, I don't think she knew exactly what was wrong with her at the time.
Yeah, and so there were a couple of things that happened that he thought maybe could have contributed to all this. One was that her father had died in her house and he had fallen down the stairs, and so she was the one that found him, and that's traumatic.
Oh, yeah.
And then that had happened just right before this case with Joe and Lori got started. So she's already upset about losing her father that way and dealing with his death. So she gets physically sick at the same time. And she didn't really say what was wrong with her, and he didn't know what was wrong. And all he knew is that she wasn't coming to these hearings like she should have been. And later on, he learns that she had had a car accident where she apparently passed out and that she was having mini strokes because of it. Now, I know people that have had mini strokes, and it affects a lot.
Yeah.
We don't know, and it's not our business. Was she under the care of a physician, whatever? But ultimately, it was affecting how this case was starting to flow.
Yeah.
And that becomes a big problem, regardless of medical conditions, because as we know, this is a very hotly contested custody dispute with major allegations.
Sure.
So it's not something that I'm sure she intended to let slip. I think she got overwhelmed with everything.
Yeah. Yeah. So he says he had some conversations with her where she would call, and it just didn't make sense. So he says, then I'm starting to question her competency. I think what actually happened, he thinks, is she was having some kidney problems and was in a lot of pain, and the doctor gave her some pain medicine. So I think some of these phone calls, he didn't know it at the time, but it was just a little confusing for her. Well,
yeah, you guys have heard my stories about me on morphine, and I can't recall any of it.
Yeah. So as far as Vivian, and he'll jump around a little bit, and we've tried to stay true to the order in which he shared things. So we'll come back and forth on Vivian and some other things. But there was a report saying that him and Vivian went out drinking together, and he said that didn't happen. He said at least not during this case. He says he thinks he met her for lunch a couple of times. John Hendera, which is Lori's attorney back then, he actually called Tom and wanted to meet with him. And so Tom said he decided to meet with him at a steakhouse. That they have dinner. They talked about the case. Tom tells him how he's feeling about the case. And he says, I testified to this. I had 3 drinks during that period. John had 6 or 7. And by that time, he's talking to him and saying he really didn't believe Lori either. This is John telling Tom this, that the only reason he's doing this is because Lori paid him a $10,000 retainer, and that he has to do what he has to do. Tom says, why don't you set some boundaries on this case with your client, and let's try to straighten this whole issue out.
Well, it sounds like John got some loose lips after he knocked a few back.
Yeah.
And ultimately told Tom, I don't believe her either. And as far as meeting her lawyer, Tom says that if he had worked for the county, it would be discouraged. But because he was in private practice, it happens. It's not unusual. And I've verified that just with somebody I know.
Yeah.
That it does happen. You might meet up and unwind if you're in private practice, not if you all work for the county.
Yeah.
So he just didn't know that John was going to have so many drinks during this meeting. And he said it probably wasn't the best of ideas, but it's just not out of the ordinary to go to a restaurant and discuss a case with other people.
Yeah.
But he said there was something strange going on between John and Lori. And there's a lot of talk. He said even back then that they thought Lori and John had some kind of a relationship with one another. Because somebody had saw John in the backyard and in the front yard. I'm not sure of what house, but whoever saw them was driving by, and they looked very intense. And he said it was relayed to him. They looked more like a couple than they did an attorney-client. And he said, but John was that way anyway. He would tend to violate people's boundaries. But he said ultimately there was something very weird about the two of them. And soon after, John divorced his wife, or his wife divorced him. Now, we don't know the specifics, but I mean, with it coming from Tom, I find it, I have no problem in putting it out here because I do believe Tom.
Yeah.
And I think that's not anything that's new. I think a lot of people have speculated about whether or not she had a physical relationship with her lawyer.
Yeah.
And I've even seen it theorized maybe in exchange for legal services. Who knows?
Yeah. But we do know she still owed him money.
Yeah, and ultimately he tried to remove himself from the case because he wasn't getting paid.
Yeah.
But that's much later in this.
Yep. So Vivian's becoming more and more despondent through this case. She's not making a lot of sense. He says he's not going around telling people that, especially John. So he's thinking, Vivian's struggling. He's just saying she's sick and something's not right. And it's fair to say that we all get sick from time to time. And there's health problems that can make you be forgetful and stuff like that. So, but during this process, Vivian is supposed to do a report and to come up with a final report.
Right. And so she still just doesn't have the report, and the court put in a mandate, and the judge put in a gag order saying that Vivian is to disclose to nobody what her final outcome of the case was or her assessment. And she did abide by that, although they would still, Vivian and Tom would still have frequent talks and discuss the case together, but she would never tell Tom what her final recommendation was. And about that time, she finally gets the report finished, and this is after missing appointments with Lori and everything. She makes appointments, and she just didn't show up. And again, he just knew something wasn't right because he had worked with her before, and he knew her reputation. So at this point, Vivian's ready to file a report, but before she wants to file the report, she has a big concern.
This is huge.
If she files it right now, and Tom's words, and Lori gets her little hands on it, they are afraid she's going to take off with the kids and just leave. So Vivian didn't want this report public or give it to the parties first without talking to the judge. And her recommendation was going to be that Tylee be placed with Joe.
Yeah, this is huge.
That's a big deal. And I think Vivian felt so strongly about it, she didn't even tell Tom her recommendation.
Yeah.
And they were working together. So that's how strongly she felt that Lori may just bolt with Tylee and Colby at that time.
Yeah. And it goes to show you who Lori is.
Right.
I mean, this lady is interviewing. She's talking to Tylee. And yeah.
But here's my point. When you have a mother who is alleging that her children have been sexually abused and that her daughter, who is the subject of all this, is being sexually abused by her father, you would make every single appointment on time and make sure that this moves forward to protect your daughter if, in fact, it really happened. I don't believe it happened to Tylee.
Yeah.
But it goes to show you that it wasn't a priority of hers because she wasn't coming to these meetings that would have ensured, if these allegations were true, that Tylee would be protected from Joe.
Yeah. And you got to remember, these people are professionals. They deal with this day in, day out. So they read people, just like him saying that Lori, it wasn't normal. Most parents come in and they're sad that their child was abused. I mean, you put yourself in her shoes. If you knew your kid was abused, you're not going to go in there and act the way Lori did.
No, I wouldn't be able to function.
Yeah.
I would do everything in my power to protect my child from ever being around that person.
Sure.
But she did the opposite.
Yeah.
So we had talked about ex parte motions in Lori and Chad's case, which in family court, it means that this is an issue without prior notice to the other party or the other parent. and it's based only on your affidavit or testimony that you give to the judge. So from there, if the judge issues an emergency ex parte order, the judge will typically schedule a hearing within 14 days, and the respondent must be served at least 5 days before that hearing. So to keep Lori from running off with the kids, they have an ex parte hearing. And the judge calls Tom on the phone, and he tells him the same thing, that he's worried that Lori's going to run off with these kids. And Vivian echoes that sentiment and says, yeah, I'm worried.
Yeah, that she's worried she's going to run and that she is a danger to those kids.
So I didn't know this. At that point, the judge orders that Tylee move to Joe's house. And that's before the report hits everybody's hands.
Yeah.
So they had this hearing, I guess, without Lori knowing. Yeah. And her attorney knowing.
Yeah. Nobody knew because they didn't want her to flee.
Right. And so they had the hearing, and you can't just move Tylee from Lori to Joe's with one party going. You have to have that hearing. So he said he was quite settled on the whole thing about Joe, about Tylee being handed over to Joe. And Vivian agrees. And he said, in hindsight, he may have done it a little bit differently, maybe had some visitations with Lori himself, and maybe not do it so abruptly, but he could get behind anything that would have gotten Tylee to Joe.
Yeah, because remember, him and Vivian have been talking about all this.
And it seems like when Vivian is able to concentrate and she's 100% on board with Tom.
Sure.
And everything, agreeing that she's a danger and she needs to be out of that house.
Sure. So we come to the day of the hearing, and Vivian didn't show up. So we've got this court hearing where they're supposed to decide to prove Vivian's report, and Vivian's going to give a recommendation that Tylee be moved to Joe's house, but she's not there to testify. And he says, so the only other person left was him. So he makes the recommendation that coincided with Vivian's, that Tylee should move over to Joe's house. And he says after that is when the poop hit the fan. That all this drinking stuff comes into play, that John told him during a visit that he had with him, about the drinking and all, that they filed a motion to recuse the guardian, which is Tom, at that point, because they're saying, well, you made a recommendation on what somebody else had said, and at that point had not talked to Tylee.
Right. So at this point, Tom's between a rock and a hard place because he hadn't met with Tylee, and that's something clearly that her lawyer's going to jump all over.
But his explanation as to why is good.
Right. He didn't want to talk to Tylee about anything related to the case until Vivian was finished with her. He wanted to have a fresh start, and he wanted Vivian to be able to talk to Tylee without any influence of something that Tom said, because he knew it was going to come back. And also, you're dealing with a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
So you don't want to confuse her with a bunch of strangers who are professionals and confuse the child. It could be very counterproductive to do that. So he was really trying to keep it simple for Tylee and not make it overwhelming. And then you get mixed signals, or a 4-year-old, they can't comprehend the depths of this stuff. And
Exactly.
Tom knew that.
Exactly. And I don't even know if it's in here, but at one point he says Tylee is a walking crime scene.
Right.
It's somewhere. I don't know, but I think that's so true.
He wasn't talking about Joe. He was talking about the manipulation that Lori did.
With Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to... Has anyone seen the bride and groom?
Sorry, we're here. We were getting lucky in the limo and we lost track of time.
No, Lucky Land Casino, with cash prizes that add up quicker than a guest registry.
In that case, I pronounce you lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Daily bonuses are waiting. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
To her, it made her a crime scene because it should be a crime how Lori did this whole thing was his opinion.
And she's 4.
Yeah, I mean, that's a baby. I'm sorry. 4-year-olds can barely follow simple instructions. I mean, much less be thrown into this complex case with all these professionals that you don't know. And according to Tom, Tylee was very clingy to Lori.
Yeah.
And like most 4-year-olds are with their mother. So he just wanted to do it very delicately, but also let Vivian's report finish and then build upon that.
Yeah, and it's not like he wasn't talking to Vivian after she would meet with Tylee. I mean, he was discussing with Vivian what was going on, so he knew what was being said.
Right. They kept each other very up to date, and they were always on the same page.
Yeah.
In spite of all the confusion with her health issues or whatever, it seemed like ultimately they both agreed Lori was a danger.
Yep. So he says I was exactly correct on stuff coming back on him, because during that hearing he said I mentioned some of the people I spoke to, several witnesses and that kind of thing. And sure enough, during that hearing, they start complaining that I tried to persuade these witnesses into saying certain things and that I bullied them. And he says, I did not do any of that. He said all he did was talk to them and got what they had to say.
Right. And I think he was even accused of trying to bully Joe's sister, Annie Cushing.
Yeah.
And he says he did not. It seems like they actually talked a couple of times during this during this time. And he said there was just nothing he could do to satisfy anybody. He says, if I talked to Tylee, I would have got creamed. I didn't talk to Tylee, I got creamed. What can I do? But he said in his mind, at least, he preserved what Tylee had to say without any influence from him. So they couldn't come back and say that he put all this stuff in her head. So that's when they filed the motion to separate him. And their reasoning was that he had not seen Tylee. And he said the reason is because he made that recommendation to the court that Tylee be placed with Joe.
Yeah.
So
we've seen it time and time again. When Lori doesn't get her way, everybody pays.
Katie bar the doors.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, and so this is kind of the point in the conversation we have with Tom where it really started to make a little more sense to me. Because I'd always thought, why would he want to change his testimony just to stay on the case? He's private practice. The county's not paying him.
Yeah.
It's just that because he said what Lori and her lawyer did not want to hear, they were going to do everything to get him off and get a different opinion.
Because they didn't think that he was correct, and they didn't want to send Tylee to Joe. So this next part, I mean, for me is a huge deal for me. So he hired an attorney to fight his recusal. And he said that's a little bit on the unusual side, more so than drinking and unbeknownst to either me or my attorney. This is crazy. So he is not afforded an attorney in court. And he says when I was with Travis County, they always had a county attorney that came with them to court. On any kind of motion to recuse the guardian. And he said what Judge Livingston explained was that because the county has overall responsibility and authority in all of this, they have their own side to this and that they can provide you an attorney. But when you're in private practice, you can't have your own attorney. You have your attorney that you can consult with, but the attorney isn't there to question people or do stuff with you. With people on the stand during the actual court hearing. So neither him nor his attorney knew that.
Right. So
it's weird.
Yeah, it is weird. But I guess it makes sense. If you are a private company, they're not going to use county money or city money to pay for your attorney.
But you would still think that your attorney could, ask people questions.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a little weird.
Legality of all that, but I mean, I think it was important enough to him because he says it later, but that he was just afraid this case would unravel, and because they wanted him gone, simply because he recommended that Tylee go with her dad.
Yeah, and remember, he's the one who brought Vivian on. He brought her on because she is top notch. I mean, good as they get.
Right, and he felt some responsibility to make sure that this case stayed fluid and there were no hiccups, because he knew the risk Tylee was in being with her mother.
Yeah, so he's paying for his own attorney. He's paying an attorney to fight being recused from this case, which I think says a lot.
Right.
So we're going to jump back. He jumps back a little bit and talks about Vivian missing court. And he says Vivian not showing up for the first hearing kind of threw everything into a tailspin, kind of just a bunch of problems. So he makes multiple phone calls over to her house trying to get in touch with her, left messages, emailed her. He actually sent a fax over, and he doesn't hear anything. So a day before the motion to recuse the guardian hearing, he goes over to her house and goes up to her door, and she's not there. But he says, if I remember right, her daughter was home, and he stressed to her daughter, please have your mom at this hearing, because it's very important. So with all the measures he took place, to make sure she showed up, she still didn't show up. So this is 2 hearings that she's missed, and both of them are highly crucial hearings, especially on the second one where they're trying to get rid of the child's advocate. And he says at that point he's upset.
I understand.
Yeah. I mean, he doesn't know what's going on with her. He's gotten some strange calls from her. He said, but nonetheless, I still had confidence in her evaluation and her assessment of the case. He said everything gelled really well with the other reports he was getting. He was having conversations with her all throughout the process, so he knew what was going on. And he says these were quite lucid, very straightforward conversations with what was going on with Tylee. So he still felt confident in her recommendation. And he said the issue was just her not showing up.
Yeah, and that put him in a really bad situation, because not only has he recommended her to join this case as she did, now she's just not showing up. And not only is she not showing up for hearings about Tylee, at this point, she's not showing up when the person that brought her on is threatened to be kicked off the case.
Yeah.
So this is the beginning of a really big problem. So at this point, Lori's attorney, he wants to get rid of both Tom and Vivian. And Tom says he put up a heck of a fight and he was successful. The judge didn't take him off the case. And he said, every time I hear folks say I was removed, he was not removed off the case. He said, ultimately, the reason he got off the case is that everybody ran out of money, and he's private practice.
Yeah.
And he charges $100 an hour to do his work. And everybody's retainer, both Joe and Lori's retainer, have been depleted. He said he spent $1,000 or more on his own attorney to defend himself in this case. And he said that's why he got off the case. It wasn't that he was removed or pushed. He wasn't getting paid. He said if he went to the Public County Domestic Relations Office for a public guardian, they'll do the entire case for $1,200, and then that's it.
Yeah. So he's saying if they would have went that route, it would have been obviously cheaper. But I mean, him fighting like he did, I mean, that shows that, one, obviously he cares for kids because that's what he's doing.
Right.
But he felt strongly that they were right.
Yeah. And I just think that once you kind of hear his side, it made sense to me. I felt, because if you remember on Dateline, he and Vivian both just said, I wish that they had listened to us way back then.
Yep. But again, here's Lori manipulating the system.
Right. And so what, to me, after we were done with this whole conversation, I thought, well, yeah, I mean, it's the same in paper never refuses ink is a saying that my grandpa used to say. But it's kind of one of those things where even court papers tell one side of the story. And so for me personally, I thought at the time that Tom was a terrible guardian. And what is he doing? And why would you change testimony? But you find it's not that. According to Tom, that was never the case. And we get to that later, how that came in.
Yeah. So John Hendera actually was wanting to continue with what they were doing, but he couldn't pay for both sides of this. And he says he was pretty much broke at that point as well. Lori, with all this stuff going on, that she wasn't paying him anything.
Especially since he said the kid needs to go to Joe's.
Yeah.
Right. She's not going to give him money for that.
Yeah. And he said, I think the judge had even ordered them to pay, but because their retainer money was gone, he never got anything out of Lori.
Yeah. And one thing that Tom made clear to us is that Joe never formally adopted Colby. He said if Joe had adopted Colby, then Colby would have been part of the custody battle with Tylee, and he would have had access to Colby, but he never did. His client was Tylee and only Tylee.
I think that's a great point.
Right. Yeah, it is a good point. So on to the allegations that he offered to change his testimony. What did he say about that?
So they had the hearing, and the judge delays on what she wants to do in between time. And he was very adamant at this point. He said, let me be clear. There is no changing of my testimony. I continued throughout this entire case to say what I've said, that I never thought this happened. He never believed that Tylee was abused. He said, I thought this was really a bunch of lies and that Lori was coaching those kids. I never wavered from that assertion.
Yeah. And I think pretty much every professional that evaluated Tylee from what we saw in the custody documents agreed that it didn't make sense and it didn't follow typical patterns of abuse.
Yeah.
So what he wanted to do is, instead of her attorney wiping out both the therapist and the guardian ad litem, he wanted to swoop first. Tom wanted to kind of strike first. Vivian had already let him down. He can't talk to her. He can't get her on the phone. She's late to stuff, not showing up for meetings. And so he was hindered in a way.
Yep. And he's trying, I think, he brought Vivian on. So I would guess that you would feel a little bit of guilt on that you know what she's saying is right. You know that Tylee doesn't need to be in that situation, in that house. And so he's trying to clean it up.
Right. And he made clear to us on several occasions that he loves Vivian and he understands that physically what was going on with her was out of her control. And it hurt him to talk about Vivian because she's an expert. And not only that, but he admired her.
Yeah.
For the work she did. And as a person, he never had anything bad that he wished against her. It's just he didn't want what was going on with her to wreck this case.
Yeah.
So the whole idea was for the attorneys to come up with some sort of a deal.
Yep.
And Joe was on board with this.
Yeah. And the plan was to come to some kind of agreement that they would release Vivian from the case. Not drag her through all these other hearings and all the other things about her competency. Let's just get her off the case. Perhaps there's something that they could salvage out of her report. Come up with some type of agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another psychologist or sex therapist review her work, which is really kind of where he was going with this, to make sure everything in Vivian's report that the person agreed with.
Yeah, the new person coming in.
Yep. And in exchange of that they would keep him as the guardian ad litem. So he knew the case from the beginning. So he says that this is where John records the conversation that Tom's attorney and John have a conversation, and John records it.
And Tom, to the best I can remember, Tom was not there.
No.
When this happened, it was Tom's attorney and Lori's attorney.
With Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to... Has anyone seen the bride and groom?
Sorry, we're here. We were getting lucky in the limo and we lost track of time.
No, Lucky Land Casino, with cash prizes that add up quicker than a guest registry.
In that case, I pronounce you lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Daily bonuses are waiting. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
And Lori's attorney tapes this conversation and runs it to court. Yeah,
and tries to say that Tom's attorney tried to bribe John, and that was not the case. He said, I wanted to come to some agreement as to how we can deal with it and still keep the child's advocate on the case who knows everything from the beginning. So that's where all this comes into place with him trying to say he was going to change his testimony if she would keep him on the case, all that stuff.
They just twisted everything according to Tom just to get him off because of his recommendation to place Tally with Joe.
Yeah. If they would have said Tally stays with Lori, none of this would have happened.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And it really, once you talk to Tom, it fits Lori. It just fits that you don't, you say something I don't like, something that I don't want, then I'm going to make you pay.
Yep.
He's just really trying to salvage the case because at this point they've been litigating for a while. You don't want to start back at square one and put Tylee and Colby, who's living in this house too, through this again.
Yeah.
And he's worried it's going down the tubes because unfortunately you've got a caseworker who's sick.
Yeah. So he says it's normal to have those conversations. And I know attorneys meet with other attorneys all the time.
Right. He said that these kind of deals are common where, okay, if we remove Vivian, I want to stay on.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because he had an agenda. It was because he knew this case.
Yep. And he said, to give you just an idea of how the litigation was in this case, that his attorney had to hire an attorney.
Yeah.
In order to deal with this issue.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And which he paid for.
Yeah, out of his own pocket.
Yeah. So I asked the question, do you think Lori controlled a lot of those strings with her attorney? And what did he say?
He said, I think Lori did, but the attorney that she had, he had worked with him on several other cases. And they were going to meet at a restaurant and have drinks. He says, I've known John for quite some time. We've had several cases together. And he said, as long as he agreed with John, he was someone I could tend to work with up to this point. He said that John was known to violate people's boundaries. For example, he would go and knock on the door and ask to see the opposite party's child. I mean, you don't do that.
That's weird.
So he said it's messed up. And he can be aggressive to the point to where it doesn't make sense to be that kind of aggressive. And most attorneys would set boundaries with their clients, and they wouldn't put their clients on the stand knowing that they're about to tell a bunch of lies. But Tom feels that he did just that and covered for Lori.
Yep.
And he would just say whatever he wanted to, and he'd lie and do all this stuff, which is probably the type of attorney that Lori loved having because she could control her attorney like a puppet on a string.
Most definitely.
That's my theory.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Yep. So
he just felt it was a combination between Lori and John scheming at the expense of Tylee, and they're messing everything up. And so at this point, Tom says this is kind of the setup that goes into the next part of the case. How are we doing on time?
We're good. We got about 10, 15 minutes left. So
okay, cool.
We'll be good. So we're going to talk now about regarding Tylee's abuse, the allegations. So she would say that Joe crashes into her. And he said that doesn't sound like abuse, and that Vivian went through the whole thing, Has anyone touched you, like where your bathing suit is? With everything that goes along with all that, and all that came back as negative.
Yeah, and these guys have seen unfortunately, numerous sex rape victims, child rape victims. And I would think if you're good at what you do, very quickly you can start to see the verbal and especially the nonverbal signs that a child closes off. It becomes something they don't want to talk about. I don't think he ever gave us any indication for a second that they thought Tylee was ever touched by Joe.
No.
I mean, quite the opposite. He told us he wanted to clear Joe's name.
Yeah, that was one of his main reasons of contacting us, was he wanted to speak for Joe. And he says now, as far as Joe goes, he came off as a regular guy. He said when dealing with people like that, after 1 or 2 sessions with somebody, you could figure out if there's something not right with that person. And he says he never felt that way with Joe, that he came off as a regular person. Which is, in cases like this, he says that's unusual.
Right, because the majority of the cases that they see are actual sexual abuse cases. So it's probably unusual that you get somebody sitting in there who exhibits no signs of ever having been a threat.
Yeah. So he says in the past, he's talking about Joe, in the past he seemed to have a genuine concern for Tylee and Colby. And he says, in fact, Joe would have liked to have adopted Colby if he was given the chance. And he says that him and Joe talked about that. Mm-hmm. But both of them knew with what was going on that it would be impossible.
Yeah, there was no way at that point. I mean, if she's trying to take away his biological child.
Yeah.
There's no way she's going to give her biological child to him to adopt at this point.
Yeah. So he said he knew Joe did have a temper issue. And he said he felt it was still within somewhat normal limits. He would have occasional episodes of blowing up.
Yeah, and then if you guys were, I think Annie had told this story on Dateline where a bunch of them were visiting Joe, and I think he had some work done to the roof, and there was a rainstorm, and the roof leaked, and so he exploded. He got in his car, peeled off in front of the kids. But even with that, Tom didn't feel like he was constantly aggressive. He did say that Joe was the disciplinarian of the family. And we know the instance where Colby and Annie both talked about him twisting Colby's arm and that kind of thing. And Tom said that what was relayed to him was a lot of times he would do the timeout. But I guess there were instances where it was seen. We're not denying it happened. We weren't there.
Yeah.
Where he did get physical with Colby.
Yeah.
And you know, we trust Colby's story. And so I think, Child Protective Services, they also agreed that Tylee was being coached.
Yeah.
And what happened during the interview?
So an interview Tylee had with CPS, Tylee blurts out, "See, Mama, I told them what you told me to say." So Tom says none of them thought that any of this had any merit to it. Joe was given visitation over at Kids Exchange, which is where he says this is where we exchange children during these awful divorces.
Gosh, these poor kids.
Yeah.
Wow. It's just like, to me, you make a baby, and if it doesn't work out and you don't make that kid your priority to make sure that transition is as healthy as possible. I mean, Lori did the exact opposite of what any decent mother would do.
Yeah.
She did not protect her kids. She used Tylee as a weapon to get what she wanted. And I think the reason this is important is this was way back in 2007, but it's a pattern. And we see that pattern from what we've learned in the last year and a half following this case that followed her up until these kids were murdered.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So this is where Alex comes and stun guns Joe, and Joe believes that Alex is trying to kill him. And Tom says, I think he probably was.
Yeah, and that I'd never really heard that Joe was afraid Alex would kill him. I mean, you get stun gun to the chest or whatever, it's clear he's not wishing you well.
Yeah.
But I kind of wondered, is that why he had that extra deadbolt on his door? And I think when you have something like that happen, maybe.
Well, when you hear this next part, this was shocking for me. So Tom says there was another event that happened early in the case, and he said, which at the time I didn't put a lot of stock into it, which now he does.
Yeah.
And he says that Joe, about a month or two into the case, that Joe called him and said, someone's been over in my house.
Oh.
Somebody's been going through my stuff. And he said what it was, Joe had left to go to a hearing. It was one of their hearings, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And during that hearing, after he came back, all his stuff had been rifled through. And Joe says, I can't say for absolutely sure that someone was in my house, but it sure seems like it, because I had papers on this pile. I had my computers going. And he said now they were the blue screened as though someone had been in it. And I had to reboot both computers. The door wasn't the same way that he left it. He says they debated at that point. And Tom says, in fact, he told him to call the police to file a report. But he didn't think Joe ever did.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure for Tom, learning about this in January, I mean, all of us have more than a year on Tom as far as knowing what happened since 2007, because he just never kept up with them, obviously, after this ended. It has to be very weird for him to look back at little things now, knowing what he knows.
Yeah.
There has to be, and I'm sure it is a heavy weight to bear for Tom in a lot of ways, and Vivian too.
Yeah.
And, I found I could kind of see it in their faces on Dateline. There has to be a weight.
Yeah.
Which is why I feel so bad for saying something bad about him.
Well,
I'm so sorry, Tom.
We were early on in the case, and we were just going through court documents. So
yeah, it was a lesson for me. So I'm learning as we do this.
This is a great place to stop because we can pick up and continue on numero 2.
Yeah, we still have a lot to go, guys. It like we say, he was very forthcoming, and I feel very differently about Tom Ware now that we've had this conversation with him. We were shocked when he got in touch with us, and really for us, this is the first time we've had somebody associated with this case reach out and want to tell their side. So it meant a lot that he felt like he could come to us and trust us with it.
Yep.
So we are definitely relaying to you guys what he feels and what he says. And I hope that it's given everybody something to think about, because I really do in my heart believe that Tom and Vivian, as best she could, and especially Tom, did everything he could.
Yeah, they tried.
They tried hard.
Yep.
And sometimes the courts just don't work in your favor.
Yep.
But yeah, I think this is a good place to stop. And maybe we'll try to get the next one out in the next day or two instead of Wednesday. I don't know. We'll figure it out between us.
Yeah.
But
there's some more good little nuggets.
Some very good nuggets. Yeah. And we have some things to share about Alex that we've learned through Tom that I really haven't seen anywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, but and to all of our new listeners, I know we had some new people that were going to listen tonight. We just want to welcome you and hope you like what you hear. And if you don't, I'm sorry. We try.
That's all right. We try. Some people don't like us, and that's okay.
That's okay. Some people think we're too goofy, and that's all right, but we're never going to change.
Yeah, I love being goofy.
I do too. I'm never growing up.
That's right.
I mean,
it keeps
like,
you young.
Physically, you see today, you're growing up with your little rickety knees.
Them
but
35 steps I had to go up about 59 million times.
But we always say that we've been best friends for 30 years, and our friendship has never matured past probably the age of 15, and it's never gonna.
Yeah.
So we try to keep it fun and light because this is all heavy stuff.
Oh, man.
This is not, a comedy podcast, but I think we get to giggling sometimes and we can't help it. That's why we can't sit and look at each other. We are totally blind from each other. Right? I can't see her.
Yeah, we had a listener ask that.
Yeah.
And we were like, no, we do not sit next to each other.
We would never make it through. So,
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to knock off now, and we will see you guys in the next couple of days when we continue this conversation with Tom Ware.
To be continued.
Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to... Has anyone seen the bride and groom?
Sorry, we're here. We were getting lucky in the limo and we lost track of time.
No, Lucky Land Casino, with cash prizes that add up quicker than a guest registry.
In that case, I pronounce you lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Daily bonuses are waiting. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.